When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, and welcome back to our rereading of A Game of Thrones. Today we'll be doing Arya I. So, this is going to be a shorter video just based upon the fact that this chapter is very short. There's not actually a lot that really happens in this chapter outside of just introducing us into Arya, and also just a little bit of foreshadowing. We have some conflict with Robb and Joffrey at the end of this chapter, something that is a scene that I wish the show would have done. I'm not sure why D&D didn't adapt this scene. It's a very good scene, and it goes to establish a lot further on in the conflicts that go on there. But yeah, we're going to start at page 68, and we'll be catching up with Arya. She's kind of doing her sewing lessons, or I guess, I don't know if it's lessons, but just doing her needlework, trying to get better. And it kind of is very similar to what we see on screen. Arya is kind of off by herself, and she's kind of watching other people while trying to do her needlework. She realizes it's not very good. And also, what's different about this one than other times is that they're joined by Myrcella. So that is kind of a little introduction, prelude into what is going on here. And let's continue into the chapter. So we're introduced also to one of the other main key points of this chapter is kind of showing the differences between Arya and Sansa. And I also think it's a bit different than just Arya versus Sansa, where I feel like all of the other children, outside of maybe Bran, take more of the Stark personality, whereas Sansa takes more of the Tully personality. And we see this right away, where Arya is kind of looking at her stitches, and they're just crooked. They're not very good. She's not very good at this. She's not made for this. And she compares them to Sansa's, who she kind of looking over, like in the picture in the background. Sansa's are kind of always perfect, right? They're always great. Sansa is this person that we constantly see from Arya's eyes as being this perfect womanly figure. She does all of the right things that a woman should be doing in this society. And another thing we kind of pick up from Arya in this first page is Arya kind of feels like she is forgotten about. She kind of feels like the one that isn't really special. You know, Robb is Robb the Lord. Bran, we know from Catelyn's last chapter, is someone that Bran is kind of like her favorite. Rickon's the baby, so of course he's going to get all the attention. Sansa's the oldest, the pretty one. She's the perfect one. And Arya's just kind of Arya. She's not really given all this special treatment. She feels very forgotten about. And Arya notes that even she has been told that she has the hands of a blacksmith. And she's told this by Septa Mordain. Again, so I think there is a common theme here where Septa Mordain almost, to a degree, bullies Arya. It's not this idea where, if you think about a teacher, right? So that's what Septa Mordain more or less is. Septa Mordain is a teacher, but just not of, like, educational stuff, but more about how you do your womanly things. So sewing, how to talk like a lady, how to act like a lady, and how to do all these things where they will eventually become good wives, good, helping of their husbands of running a household. Like how Catelyn kind of arranges like the feasts and stuff like that. It's kind of similar in that regard. And Septa Mordain at this point is kind of giving all of her attention to Myrcella, kind of playing favorites. It just seems like what Mordain does. I'm not a huge fan of Mordain. She's this character that is played up to be, this very helpful character, but the only people she seems to help are the people she really likes. Arya, yes, maybe a trouble child to her, but Septa Mordain does nothing to help that. She doesn't try to give Arya extra attention to help her keep up. She just forgets about Arya. And that's kind of the vibe I get from this whole interaction and how Arya's thinking and the way we see this chapter play out. It makes me like push the wrong way. And the way I even back this up is when we look at Myrcella, yes, she is a royal child and she should be getting attention. But her stitches are crooked as well. So why is, Mordain giving her extra attention? But Arya here, who is important as well, she is the daughter of Ned Stark, is really being left alone and kind of isolated like we see in the picture. And by the end of this page, Arya's just kind of given up. She's just kind of watching and just observing what everyone else is doing. This stitches work just sucks to her, and she just kind of gives up. And that leads us into page 69. Now, page 69 opens kind of on a very sad note because it shows us kind of that Arya has no friends. And Arya kind of is watching Jane Poole and Casselle's daughter, and they're whispering to Sansa. And Arya, with her suspicious nature, the way I'm taking this as, is that because they're whispering, because they're kind of not talking loudly, Arya's kind of like, well, are they talking about me? It's a very kid thing to do. Like, you see people whispering, and you instantly think, okay, they're talking about me. They're making fun of me. And that's kind of how I take it. Arya's just like, what are you guys talking about? And we see that they're talking about Sansa and Joffrey and how they're going to get married and they're going to have babies, whatever. And we see right away here that Sansa is still a very young girl and also is very much like her mother. Where, like we talked about, Catelyn doesn't see the negatives of Joffrey. She doesn't see what everyone else is seeing, right? Ned sees it. Robb sees it. Jon sees it. Even Arya sees it. And Sansa just doesn't see who Joffrey is. She sees him as this cute, handsome prince, and she's gonna marry him, and everything's gonna be wonderful. And it doesn't really work out. And I do think here is that I do think Arya is to a degree jealous that Sansa kind of is marrying Joffrey to a degree, just based upon the fact that I think it's one of those things that, regardless of who Joffrey is, it shows how important Sansa is, because Sansa is being used as this chip to help unite House Baratheon, Lannister, and Stark. That in alone is very important, and I think Arya kind of recognizes that, because when she's thinking, right, she's thinking back to the feast we saw in Jon 1, where Sansa gets to sit with the handsome prince, and this is noted exactly. She says the handsome prince. It's not Sansa saying that. And she got the fat one in Tommen. That, to me, shows a little bit of the jealousy and resentment Arya has towards Sansa, because Arya is kind of seen as the less important one in this situation. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, is that Sansa kind of just appears to be the literal embodiment of what a woman is supposed to be in this society, where Arya is kind of the opposite, where Sansa seems very polite on the face value of it, right? Kind of this womanly figure who is able to sew well. She knows how to talk like a lady, and she's willing to do what people tell her to do. That's kind of the whole idea of what is the normal or average woman of what they're supposed to do in this world. And Arya goes against all of that, which I think is what makes her kind of a fan favorite character, where she's this rebellious person. She's more of this character that likes to go out in the wilderness and get muddy and sword fight and be this tomboy type character in a world where that's just not very common, right? Arya is a very unique person when it comes to that idea. And that's something that Arya, I don't think she realizes in herself at this point. And with all this talk of Joffrey and Sansa, Arya kind of responds with saying that Jon thinks he looks like a girl. It's very childish, kind of just insults or whatever. And it gets kind of personal very quickly. This kind of maybe strikes a nerve with Sansa, that she's insulting his or her prince or her husband to be. And she goes to Arya. She's basically like, well, Jon is a bastard. He is just jealous. Which is funny, because this is actually true. When we go back to Jon 1, now again, it's true, but it's true to a degree. Jon is right on who Joffrey is as a person. He is completely correct. But at the same time, if we go back to Jon 1, if we remember, Jon was kind of spiteful of Joffrey because he was this tall figure. He's taller than Jon and Robb already. He's this very important person while Jon is a bastard. We go back to that. And Sansa, there is a grain of truth in here, but it's not for the right reason, right? Jon doesn't think that Joffrey is this kind of bad figure, or he looks like a girl because he's jealous. It's because he kind of sees through who Joffrey is as a person. And that's something Sansa just hasn't seen yet. And this kind of crosses a line for Arya, because Arya is very close to Jon, whereas Sansa is not. Sansa is really she's like the only one of the Stark children that really doesn't have any type of relationship with Jon that's kind of positive. Sansa calls him a half brother, doesn't even really consider him like a full brother. Arya, takes the opposite route. She's like, he is our brother. And at this moment now, Arya has kind of raised her voice, and it draws the attention of Septa Mordain. And again, this is again showing how adequate Sansa is with words. And she's talking about how, oh yeah, we were just saying how nice it is to have Myrcella with them. And it's interesting because this is foreshadowing to Sansa and what she'll have to do in her struggles later on in the series. But that was a little note that's interesting to talk about, how she's going to have to be able to lie and also play the game a little bit. So it's a little bit of a wink to what Sansa's whole character is going to be about and what she's going to be building up as the series goes on. And Sansa again corrects Arya by saying he's a half-brother. And again, like I mentioned, Arya takes after Ned while Sansa takes after Catelyn. They're really two different characters. And that is something that really drives a wedge between the characters for the beginning and really almost the entire book series. It'll be interesting to see how they come together and how their experiences will change them as people. And that will bring us into page 70. So page 70 is going to be kind of all about this idea of Septa Mordain kind of coming over, and she kind of just starts bullying Arya for absolutely no reason. So the Septa comes over and she's going, Arya, why are you not working? And how her stitches look terrible. And again, it's one thing to privately go to Arya and say, okay, your stitch work is subpar. You know, I've been noticing you haven't been working as hard, and that route, right? Because then you're going to kind of gain a little bit more trust from a character like Arya when you're going out of your way privately after a session or whatever and trying to offer them advice and how to do it better. And doing this in front of Myrcella, in the royal family, her sister, all of these people that are kind of sneering down on Arya, it's incredibly embarrassing. I mean, I want you to think about this as you're a young kid, right? And so let's say, I don't know if, you know, American, whatever, you're in grade school, or you're in kind of this lower school or whatever. You're in the beginning of your school time, basically, wherever you're from. And the teacher just starts calling you out, saying, you're not doing your work good enough. This looks terrible, whatever. Like, imagine you're in an art class, for instance, and the teacher just starts going, this painting is terrible, okay? You need to work, you're not working hard enough. This is awful. In front of everybody. Septa Mordain goes in so hard on Arya that she's on the verge of tears. Right? And she basically decides she's out of here. Right? She's gone. And Septa Mordain saying, oh yeah, I'm going to tell your mother about this and whatever. It does not come off as a very teacher type person. Septa Mordain to me is one of those characters that I really just dislike in the way that she treats Arya. Like, how is this acceptable, in my opinion? Like, if Ned had seen this firsthand, because I don't think Ned really understands to the degree how Septa Mordain treats Arya. And this to me is just inexcusable. This is bullying of a child at such a young age, by an adult, right? And we see that Septa Mordain takes favorites. Sansa and all her friends at this moment as well, they're not doing their patchwork or their stitch work. They were gossiping about Joffrey and Sansa. So again, Septa Mordain, not a great character. Glad she dies. But yeah. So the last part of this page is kind of explaining how Arya feels like she gets nothing from her parents, while Sansa got everything. And Arya, I don't think she understands what that means. But what she's trying to say is that Sansa's pretty. Sansa knows how to dress. Sansa basically does everything better than Arya, except ride horses and to, like, keep a count. And I don't think Arya kind of understands who she is as a person yet. She doesn't understand what her good characteristics are that Sansa doesn't have. Arya has great survivability. She's someone that can think on her feet. She's someone that has more of the street skills, while Sansa has more of maybe the book smarts. And Arya is a character that has just very different skills than Sansa. And Arya just at this point doesn't really see those things in herself. And again, it's a great arc that we're going to see with Arya as she goes further into this book. And even physically, I mean, Arya is darker hair. She has a long face. Sansa got all of the Tully features. It's interesting. And I think here when we talk about the riding of horses and that's being one of Arya's best skills, it is a little bit of a parallel to Lyanna, which is an interesting idea that Arya kind of acts like Lyanna as well. But the thing here that is different is when Arya is getting, compared to Lyanna a lot. Lyanna was always described as being very beautiful. Like, she has, for the most part, kept Robert Baratheon in love with her all this time, even while she's dead. And Arya is never described really like that. Arya is kind of described as like a boy at times. Like, Arya gets away with being a boy for a while. So it is an interesting idea. And that's going to kind of lead us into page 71. And it's going to be the second half of this story, or of this chapter. And it's much more interesting. It's going to see Arya and Jon together, and they're going to be kind of looking over the fights going on and with either Tommen and Bran, or Joffrey and Robb, which we don't actually get to see a sword fight, but it would have been nice if we would have. But we see a little argument that's going to foreshadow some events to come, and that will kind of get us into page 71. All right, starting back from where we left off into page 71. So page 71 is kind of a direct follow-up where she's kind of left, and she's more or less just kind of sitting there with Nymeria. Kind of in the page that I have in the background. A little bit different, of course. This is a picture from probably a little bit later on, but you get the point. This is more or less what's kind of happening. And what I think, to me, is something that maybe I had just not picked up on the last few rereadings I've done of A Song of Ice and Fire, is that in this first chapter, we get a very heartbreaking thing from Arya's mind. Arya basically is thinking how, if no one else loved her, at least Nymeria seemed to. And it really paints to me how Arya is feeling. She doesn't feel loved. And I think that's very apparent and obvious from the way Arya is framed in this first chapter. And I think it's a good setup for her as a person, and growing into those roles of, even when she looks back, I think she realizes that she was loved, but just in different ways. And I think we'll see that later as she has more, connection with Ned when they go to King's Landing. And even with her trying to settle her differences with Sansa later on in the books, as their relationship deteriorates even more than it already does. But again, a very heartbreaking thing that, no one should really have to feel. And that's something that Arya feels in this moment. And like I had said, Arya names her direwolf Nymeria, and she names it after the warrior queen, which to me is very fitting for Arya's character. And what's even more fitting is the way that Sansa names her direwolf Lady. In my opinion, the least cool name of all the direwolves. Like, it's so, like, Lady. Really? Like, I mean, I get it from, like, why George named, or has that direwolf named that, and why Sansa names that, but just in comparison to all the other direwolves, not the best name. And like we kind of see with the direwolves, right? Because again, we don't have many, up to this point so far in the story, we don't really have any interaction with the direwolf and their owner. And we see that Nymeria and Arya get along quite well, and this will kind of be built upon later in the story, and also with Arya as well, with Nymeria, before they tragically have to depart. And I think something here that's very interesting that is a little bit showing Arya's resourcefulness later on in the story, and especially this book when she is having to try and escape King's Landing, is that in her mind, Arya rationalizes what she can do now, right? Now that she's left Septim Ordain and all that's going on, she's thinking, well, if I go back to my room, right, what's going to happen? My mother's going to be there, I'm going to get scolded, and that's all that's going to happen. While instead of that, I can kind of sneak over to where the boys are practicing in the yard and kind of watch them fighting. It kind of shows how Arya, she thinks about things, right? Where if you think about Arya in her chapter where Ned dies, right? There's this idea that there are some quote-unquote Stark men next to like a ship or the docks, basically. And this is really used to bait Arya, and Arya thinks about that and goes, wait, this is a trick. It's just kind of like this little bit of foreshadowing or building of Arya's character for those moments to make sense later on. And finally, when she kind of starts to reach the yard, she reaches the area and sees Jon waiting there with Ghost. Now, what is very interesting here to note is that Ghost is actually much larger than the other direwolves. So Nymeria is actually a lot smaller, which is very interesting in the way that people have taken that. Some people think that's because Jon is actually the oldest child of Ned, more, making him even older than Robb, and making it then he should be the ruler of the North or of Winterfell instead of Robb. Could be, it could always go back to the way I've always taken this stuff, that like Jon is the one that has developed the quickest. He is the character that is kind of had to mature the fastest, and even though we do see that he, you know, has some immaturities, he's still the most mature probably of all of the Stark kids. And we kind of just have this time now where Arya and Jon are just sitting here together watching what's going on. And that will lead us into page 72 and the kind of the back little portion of this chapter. And this is where we're going to see a lot of our foreshadowing to the Lannister-Stark conflict with not the parents, but the children. Very similar to the way we see in House of the Dragon with, say, Alicent's kids and Rhaenyra's kids. So we note that Arya is actually very disappointed to see Bran and Tommen fighting because, again, these are two very young kids. They don't really know what they're doing. They're heavily padded with wooden swords. It's not really that much of entertainment for Arya, and even Arya notes that she thinks she could probably do better. And I mean, I think it's probably true. I think Arya would probably beat Tommen and Bran pretty easily, but you know, we never get to see that, so whatever. So then we learn that Roderick Cassel is instructing them, and what I think is funny is that it's even noted in the actual book of how amazing his whiskers are, which I always thought was a funny little nod to his character and makes him kind of defined as a character, something that stands out. And we see that Robb, Theon, and others are watching and cheering them on, while others, like Joffrey, aren't really. We kind of get the note here that Robb is very supportive of Bran, trying to, you know, see him do well, while Joffrey just seems uninterested, and he just seems, like, embarrassed by Tommen, or that Tommen should be doing better. And that kind of just shows the difference in character between the two. And Jon and Arya, they kind of start poking fun at what's going on, and it builds how close they are. Because Arya, this whole chapter has been about establishing how she feels very lonely, how she has no one. And then directly after, we see how great of a relationship Arya and Jon have, which is something that's nice. We kind of see that Arya maybe is exaggerating, and that she does have people to care about her like Jon. Now, what I think is very interesting is we get this idea that when Arya was younger, she thought that she was a bastard because she looked nothing like her siblings. Right? Again, remember, Robb, Sansa, Bran, they all have the Tully features, right? Where Arya has the Stark features, so she looks really different, and she looks a lot like Jon. And she's kind of freaking out. She's like, you know, am I a bastard? And Jon's kind of the one that's like, no, Arya, you're not a bastard. You're fine. But this is interesting when you think about it from Arya was so worried and didn't want to be a bastard this much. I think that does help her understand Jon as a person a bit more, whereas other people don't really have any sympathy for Jon. They don't treat him like an equal, like Catelyn. People like Catelyn, Sansa. And I think that's what another interesting element to Arya's character. And Arya, even with, you know, just talking about that, she asks this question like, why isn't Jon, why aren't you down there? And she kind of feels stupid because Jon basically just says he's a bastard. He can't. And it really shows you kind of the social class and how stupid things are, because Jon has a different mother than Robb and Bran. He's not allowed to participate in this sword dueling, even when Jon is probably just as good as Robb, if not better, is a little interesting. And Jon more or less is like, life is not fair. And even Arya is thinking about that, like, that life is really not fair. And this can go to many different things, right? Arya, remember at the beginning, or not the beginning, but in this chapter talks about how Sansa got all of the good qualities while she got all of the bad qualities. And I think that kind of applies to what Arya's thinking, not only with Jon's whole idea of in his plot, but with Arya herself as well, that she did not get the things that traditionally you would want as a woman. And again, Arya brings up like how I'd said that she thinks she could probably beat Tommen and Bran, and that she's even older than Bran, so maybe that'd help her somehow. But Jon's basically like, you couldn't even lift a sword, which again sprinkles the ideas of what Jon is going to give Arya. But it is an interesting idea here that even here, Arya Arya just it does not fit the role of a woman in this society, and it's very interesting to see. So that will kind of lead us into page 73, and things are going to kind of start to kick off, right? We're going to start seeing some heightened stakes and things to come. So page 73, Jon asks Arya if he notices Joffrey, and we notice again how observant Jon is. Jon is this character that we've talked about, and every single time he's brought up how observant he is. Jon notices that on his surcoat, the Baratheons and Lannisters are split, kind of showing that they are equal status, which is not really true, because in reality, the Baratheons should be the one that is taking place, not both. And this tells us a lot about, A, the Lannister family, how they view themselves, and 2, again, more and more foreshadowing to this idea that the Lannisters are looking for more power, okay? And that is the big idea here of what Jon is trying to tell Arya. And Arya kind of like refutes this and basically is like, well, the mother is important too. Like, why should you only have your father's sigil, right? So for instance, Arya is a Tully and a Stark. Her father's a Stark, mother's a Tully. So how come on her, say her clothing, why wouldn't she have a wolf and then also a fish? And Jon kind of teases her and stuff, but it is an interesting idea that why don't more houses do that, right? Why don't we see that more often? It's an interesting idea and shows kind of how women are discriminated against in this world, with how their family is not represented, but the father's is. It's an interesting idea that Arya brings up in this chapter, and I thought that was interesting to note as well. And Bran, he finally wins his fight, and now Roger calls for Robb and Joffrey. And this is where it gets kind of interesting, right? Because Robb is 2 years older than Joffrey, so Robb theoretically should have the advantage on Joffrey. But we see like kind of right away that Joffrey doesn't want to fight this. Joffrey, he's not really, it doesn't look like he's even broken a sweat. It doesn't look like he's actually been fighting at any point. And Joffrey kind of refutes it, saying, wooden swords are for children. You know, I'm not doing this, whatever. He basically like scoffs at it. And Robb, on the other hand, is willing. He's ready to go. He is sweating still from another fight that it seems like he had been doing. And it shows us the differences between the two characters, where Robb is a serious character and he'll get things done, where Joffrey is this character that is kind of a coward, not kind of, is a coward, and also isn't really about getting dirty and doing things himself. And we see that. And Theon, which I think makes a very smart remark, even though it's kind of a joke, he basically refutes Joffrey's claim by saying, yeah, you both are children, which is true. These are children of 14 and 12. It's an interesting concept. So this is going to lead to this whole idea of why Joffrey isn't fighting, and kind of leading to this heightened conflict and argument, and almost leading to a fight between Robb and Joffrey right away. And that will lead us into page 74. So Robb kind of starts page 74 by mocking Joffrey. He's saying, oh, you took more hits than gave them, and that, Joffrey, you're scared. That's why you don't want to do it. And Joffrey responds that, Robb, you're older, and they should fight with live steel, which Cassel I don't know why I said Cassel will not permit, but saying they can use blunted tourney blades. And I do think this is interesting, because you really shouldn't be giving these kids live steel, especially when you have the royal prince. Doesn't really make any sense. If there's an accident here, Cassel is going to be in deep shit. So again, this is a good decision by Cassel. But this kind of prompts the Hound to step in. And he's basically like, who are you to tell the crown prince what to do? Also, something that is interesting is even Arya from this distance notes that Joffrey is just an ass, which I think everybody knows except for Sansa and Catelyn. But just, I wanted to bring that up to again further show that even Arya can kind of see through this bullshit. But I want to talk about here about what the Hound says here. Like, who are you to tell the crown prince no? And that's a very interesting idea, because we talk a lot about power, right? And in this moment, where is the power? Because you have the Master of Arms in a castle that is not your own. You're a visitor here. Is Cassel in charge, or should Joffrey be in charge? It's an interesting idea, and I think Cassel more or less responds how I think anyone would respond in his situation. he basically says he is master at arms and he is in charge of training. That is his job. That's his duty put down from him by Ned. And the Hound counters was saying he is training them like women, and that Robb is 14. He killed a man when he was 12. And again, this shows how brutal the Hound is, for one, building on that part of his character. But it's interesting to say that he is training them like women. And when you especially get to later on in the story, where we know Robb is a very competent swordsman and he is a very good military commander, it would seem like Cassell is actually doing a very good job of teaching him. So, again, I think you just come at it from two different ways of training, and both can work, but I don't think the Hounds is necessarily the best way. And Robb, even in this moment, is kind of eager to beat Joffrey, because this is kind of a pride thing, right? Because basically the Hound is like, yeah, Robb, you're a child and you're training like a girl, more or less, is basically what he just told Robb. And Robb's now like, okay, you think that? Let's go, Joffrey. And Joffrey kind of just walks away, telling Robb to fight him when he gets older and becomes a man. And this foreshadows a lot, right? Come back to me when you're older and become a man. And we'll know that later, when he'll be 15, leading an army, becoming a man, he is king of the North, and coming to King's Landing to kick Joffrey's ass. Doesn't go that way, but that is the intent. And it's an interesting way that George builds these things that we'll see later on pay off. And I love that about George's work. And that will lead us into page 75, our last page of the chapter. So page 75, we see that Robb is basically being held back. Like, Robb, if he wasn't being held back, probably would have attacked Joffrey or like tried to beat him up, basically. And Theon's kind of holding him back and not letting it happen. And the page kind of ends with Jon telling Arya to go back to her room, and Arya responding saying it wasn't fair, she had to do needlework, and Jon responds saying nothing is fair. And that's a perfect way to end this chapter, because we see again how fair it is that Joffrey gets to treat people like this. We see how fair is it that Jon's going to the wall, and his life, how he's being treated. How is it fair that Arya, the way she is treated by Septim Ordain, while Sansa's treated a completely different way? It even seems like her mother treats her differently than Sansa. How is it fair? And Jon responds that basically saying that this world is not fair. Justice, or maybe honor or duty, sometimes it's just not fair. Sometimes what should happen doesn't. And sometimes the villains win. And that's kind of what you take from that. And I want to kind of preference this. So I want to ask you guys at the end of this recording, on this video, what do you guys think of this chapter? So for me, I say this like in every video. I'm doing a chapter rankings. I'm basically having a quick summary and rating the episode out of 10. And I'm going to do a video when I get done with the entire book, ranking every chapter. What do you guys think of this chapter compared to the previous chapters? For me, this is actually my least favorite chapter. Not a lot personally happens in this chapter compared to other chapters. This chapter is very much about Arya and Sansa's conflict, building Jon and Arya, and then also the Robb and Joffrey conflict. There's not a ton here. It's also a very short chapter. So to me, I want to know what you guys think. Like, what do you guys think about this chapter? I like this chapter. I still would give it a fairly high ranking, but out of all the chapters we've done so far, it's probably the lowest. But let me know what you guys think. And next week, we're going to be having a very impactful chapter. Maybe not the best chapter overall, but a very impactful chapter in Bran 2. And for anyone that knows what happens in Bran 2, really sets the stage for the entire story. So thank you guys all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Sorry if it was a little shorter than my normal ones. Just wasn't a ton of content I needed to talk about in this video compared to other videos. And I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye, guys.